On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Family and friends, this includes military honors.
I am Eric Schaefer, and on behalf of the Caldwell family, I wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I flew in from Denver yesterday and with an old friend went back to his house in the Palisades, which is no longer there, having a hard time grasping the loss, which is colossal if you have had the chance to go by there. The Caldwells are experiencing loss of their home and community, as well as the loss of Dan. And so I thought it appropriate, as we start this service, the celebration of life for Dan Caldwell, by reading Psalm 121, which claims God's promises even in the midst of loss and destruction. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as we gather today to remember and celebrate the life of Dan Caldwell, we come before you with heavy hearts, yet filled with gratitude for the gift of Dan and the presence he has in our lives. Comfort us in our grief. Surround us with your love. And grant us the strength to cherish the memories we hold dear. As Psalm 30 reminds us, weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. May your hope be a guiding light, reassuring us of the joy that awaits as we claim the promise of resurrection. In Jesus' name, and all of God's children said, amen. So 30 years ago, fresh out of grad school, my wife Kim and I moved across the country from Florida out here to the Palisades with our 3-month-old infant baby boy Tyler. And Dan and Lora were two of the first people that we met when we arrived in the Palisades. We instantly hit it off with background in Young Life. You guys may know Dan's father was very instrumental in starting Young Life and knew the founder, Jim Rayburn, and others. And so lots of wonderful stories, as that is my background as well in Florida. And as a young youth minister, Dan and Lora supported me and my family as we attempted to grow youth work in the Palisades, kind of a daunting task to get kids to come to church as a youth group. And so our lofty goal was truly to reach every child and every teenager in the Palisades. And it was a little slow going to start. To begin with, though, I knew I could count on at least one child or one kid to show up for the junior high youth group, John. And then a couple nights later for the senior high group, Ellen. And then we would take trips down to Tijuana to build houses, and I could count on at least one leader, Beth, to go with me down to Mexico. So we started very humbly, and God bless the ministry with hundreds and frankly thousands of kids who ultimately came through the program. Even with that, things didn't always go well. As you know, with youth ministry, there's always glitches. But one thing I knew is I could always count on Dan and Lora to support me, to the church leadership, to the community, whoever it was, to encourage me even on those days and weeks and months that I felt like giving up. Dan was one of the most generous people that I have ever met in my life. I would mention in passing that we ended up having 3 boys, and when they were little, I would say, "Oh, Dan, I'm going to try to get them out on the tennis court and teach them tennis." And within usually a day or two, Dan would show up either at my house or at the church with tennis rackets that John and Ellen and everybody had played with, and said, "Here's rackets, and off you go." And then I attempted to coach soccer, not a sport that I know that well, and I said, "Dan, I'm going to coach the boys in AYSO soccer." And again, within a day or two, cones and soccer balls and equipment, and they all said John Caldwell on it or Ellen Caldwell, and we just kind of scratched that out. And then not only that, but then printed sheets, handwritten sheets on drills that I could run at practice. So Dan just always was there for you. And one of the most touching things Dan and Lora would always do for us is, again, on a youth minister's salary, whenever it was my birthday or Kim's birthday, they would get us gift cards to go to fancy restaurants around the city that they knew that we could probably never afford to do. So always thinking of us, always so generous with his time and with looking out for us as a young family and as young parents. Dan would always speak words of life over me, always was encouraging me, and I'm sure there's many of you in this crowd where you would get a handwritten letter from Dan, right? He would see something on the news or something, and the next thing you know, it shows up in your mailbox, articles or words of wisdom that he had seen, said, "Hey, this reminded me of you." Even recently, when Dan was not well and not feeling well, I had a few quotes in a New York Times article. We were building houses for teachers. We partnered with Habitat up in Vail in Colorado, and so the Times was doing an article on workforce housing, which is now what I'm spending a ton of my time doing. And Dan was actually more excited than I was about this. He cut out the article, called me numerous times, sent it to me, and just let me know how proud he was that I had found a path and found the right thing to be doing at this time in my life. He was always thinking about ways to support his students, young families in our community. We started an evening service at our church, and this was probably about 10 years ago. We called it Sunset Crossing, our church, which unfortunately burned down with so many other structures, but it was on the corner of Sunset, and so we would do a nighttime service, and it was very casual and contemporary music, all those things that you do to attract people that maybe don't have a church family. And so somebody came up with a great idea of, hey, let's cook dinner every Sunday night so that when people come, they can hang out with their kids and whatnot. And so we couldn't find anyone to be in charge of that. So Dr. Caldwell ended up being the head cook at this service. And so we'd come in and he would be back there, and I'd make him put a hairnet on because I wanted to get an A rating for the little restaurant. And he'd be making mac and cheese and cutting up hot dogs for the kids. And so you can imagine the endless jokes of Dan, the cook, and he did this for months and frankly years. But you know what? He was so excited because people were getting plugged into a community and into a church and back to his young life roots. That is really the heart of who he was as a Christian. I have had the opportunity to see some of the old Pali Prez gang before this service, and we had a minister, John Todd. Dr. Todd is now long since retired and living in Tennessee, but a dear friend of mine, and we did ministry together for many years. He could not make it today. He was a close friend of Dan's, And he was nice enough to send me some of his thoughts, and I'm honored to share those with you now. Again, this is from John Todd. In the mid-90s, Joe, his wife, and I, John, headed for 2 weeks of mission work in Kenya. Great, but what to do with their 10-year-old son, Michael, who needs to go to school and be housed and fed and cared for while we were away? Well, obviously, you asked Dan and Lora Caldwell if they would assume the surrogate parental role, and to no surprise, they said yes. Yes, the Caldwells were already a close part of our family, but really what was at the heart of this is when Michael was 2 or 3 years old, a little toddler, he had his first crush, which is on Ellen. And from then on, the Caldwells could do no wrong. So for a fortnight, Dan walked Michael to school, spent an inordinate amounts of time with him, and became Michael's best bud. Since that event, Dan has never ceased to remind me, and he always laughed with pleasure, that when John and Joe returned from overseas and went to pick up Michael, Michael said, "Dad, could you and Mom go back to Kenya? I want to stay with the Caldwells a little bit longer." Michael had chosen Dan and Lora, but then many folks have chosen Dan and Lora to be an intimate part of their lives. They're spiritual best buds. Dan led a weekly men's Bible study for decades, truly, at the church. Not because anyone had talked him into accepting yet another teaching role, but because he saw the need. And as a result, 8 or 10 guys would gather on a Thursday morning faithfully, grow spiritually, and find new scriptural insight amidst the sweet roles that Dan would always bring with him. That fellowship became a spiritual life and a spiritual center for many of the men who discovered that fellowship and became best buds. Dan's hero and best bud was his father, John, with whom he often shared stories of adventure about his time in the Navy. The story Dan always tells is while crossing a bridge in the LA harbor, they noticed a ship that was in dry dock, just like the one that John, his dad, had captained in World War II. So just for fun, they drove over to this mothballed vessel, and you guessed it, it was the very ship that he was on during World War II. What a delight for best buds to share. For me, again, speaking as John, he was a gift of God, a true scholar in the best sense, a friend who would listen closely and speak honestly, a follower of Jesus Christ and all the richness that can bring. In Dan Caldwell, God provided any number of folk a best bud. That term best bud I love that John is using, and rarely do you get to know multiple people in one family, multiple from 2 or 3 generations. And that has been the great privilege for me to know all of you, the Caldwells. Lora, you and I have been friends for over 30 years. Dan and Lora, Lora and Dan, from the time you guys met at St. Stephen's Square in Vienna, the story Dan told me numerous times, to your time in Hawaii growing up, you all have been soulmates. You have complemented each other and modeled to all of us what it means to be a loving spouse, a hands-on parent, a loyal friend, and a committed Christian. I have so appreciated our friendship all these years. Your calm wisdom during conflict, your down-to-earth discussions as Kim and I talked about raising kids and calming us down when we thought we were at wit's end. Your sense of humor, always coming at the right moment. Your quiet, confident faith has not only been a strong foundation for your family, but Lora, you'll never know this. You have been a strong foundation for so many people here today, the entire church family in the Palisades. And I want to say to Beth and Ellen and John, as well as Joel and Nadia and Evelyn and Emiliano and Gira, you all are standing on the shoulders of your incredible mom and dad. And your dad not only lives with God right now in heaven, but he lives on through each one of you. Your dad was so proud of you, John, and Beth and Ellen, and so proud of your spouses and your families, grandkids. And every conversation we had, it never went without him sharing stories about each of you. I wanted to close with, for me, every time I hear a James Taylor song or a Jackson Browne song, I always think of Dan. And so I'm going to close with a line from Jackson Browne, a song called For a Dancer. I don't know what happens when people die. Can't seem to grasp it as hard as I try. It's like a song I can hear playing in my head, but I can't sing, I can't help listening, because I know you'd rather we were dancing our sorrow away. God bless you, Dan. Amen. I'm going to ask longtime friend Robert Williams, if you would, to please come forward and share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Robert Williams, and I'm a member of the political science faculty here at Pepperdine. I want to begin by thanking each and every one of you for being here. Whether you've crossed an ocean, a continent, or merely a street to get here, I feel confident in saying that, like me, you're here because Dan Caldwell touched your life. I want to thank Lora, Beth, Ellen, and John Caldwell for allowing Pepperdine University to host this event. Dan was always aware of Pepperdine's shortcomings. But he believed in its potential, and he worked tirelessly to make it what he believed it could be. He was often discouraged, sometimes enough to step aside from the struggle. But here's one of the remarkable things about Dan. Stepping aside for him meant going to Brown University to help create a foreign policy institute. It meant cloistering himself in his office so he could finish writing a book. Or it meant working with the Council on Foreign Relations to grow an academic outreach program. Dan did a lot of good things when he stepped away from the work to make Pepperdine better. But fortunately for this place, he always returned to the struggle. I met Dan and Lora in November 1991 when I came to interview for a faculty position. I had, about a year earlier, read a new book titled The Dynamics of Domestic Politics and Arms Control, the SALT II Treaty Ratification Debate by Dan Caldwell. I knew there was only one Dan Caldwell. Sitting in Alice's restaurant at the end of Malibu Pier, having dinner with Dan and Lora, I thought to myself, wow, I could be Dan Caldwell's colleague. Just don't blow it. I do not take for granted the great good fortune that allowed me to have Dan as my colleague, mentor, and friend for over 30 years. In some ways, our friendship defied reason. Dan was one of the most organized people I've ever known. He never said so to me, but I was probably one of the least organized people he ever knew. Dan had file folders for everything. I had piles on my desk for everything. Dan had folders for the books he had written, folders for the books he was working on, and folders for the books he thought he might someday want to write. He kept files on students, on guest speakers, on political figures, and yes, on colleagues. I worried about that last category. I mean, I know how blackmail works. But it turned out that Dan's faculty files were filled with items that would have been scrapbook material in my mother's hands. Newspaper clippings, photos, speeches and lectures, and correspondence that mentioned the person whose file it was. When Dan retired, he passed on to me a handwritten note he had received from Ken Thompson, one of my mentors at the University of Virginia. In the note, Professor Thompson assured Dan that Pepperdine had made an excellent hire. It meant the world to me that Professor Thompson had sent that note to Dan, but it meant even more that Dan had kept it in a file, his file on me, for 30 years, and that he passed it on to me when he retired. Something you probably already know about Dan is that he set high standards for everything he was involved in. My friend and colleague Brian Newman told me a story this week that I want to share. The experience he described was probably repeated in many different classrooms at Pepperdine. One day, shortly before class was to begin, Brian had a student sitting in the classroom complaining about the unreasonableness of the exam Brian had given the week before. It was just too hard. Brian said that before he could formulate a response, another student said to her peer, "You obviously haven't had Caldwell." All of us, especially his students, benefited from Dan's high standards. As important as high standards and impeccable organization are to understanding Dan's success as a scholar and teacher, there is more to life than the ivory towers, or as we prefer to say here, the concrete parking structures of academia. We can't do justice to Dan's life without talking about the importance of justice in his life. The scripture on the back of your program speaks directly to Dan's character. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? I want to say a word about how Dan put this into practice. It's clear to me that Dan studied foreign policy because he cared about the world. For over 4 decades, in courses like international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and arms control and international security, he also inspired his students to care about the world. He believed that the United States, if fully engaged and faithful to its ideals, could be a powerful force for good. In this regard, Dan's stance toward U.S. foreign policy was like his stance toward Pepperdine and its academic policies. Both carried the potential to spread light in a dark world, but neither was above criticism. What Dan taught, he also carried beyond the classroom in public lectures, op-eds, campaign work, and work with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Pacific Council on International Policy, and the Forum for U.S.-Soviet Dialogue. There was no room in his worldview for cynicism or apathy. At a private university, he carried the banner of public service. You won't have to talk to many people here today before you begin hearing stories of those who were inspired by Dan to care for the world in their own way. I have to add that Dan knew the difference between freedom and oppression. He knew the difference between a just war and an unjust war. And he certainly knew who started the war in Ukraine. As you know, Dan served in the Navy, and as Eric pointed out, he admired his father's service in World War II. And he was deep into writing the story of his father's ship at the end of his life. There's no contradiction here, but I want to make sure you understand that Dan was a peacemaker. The title of the book that he and I collaborated on, Seeking Security in an Insecure World, expressed the aim of all of his scholarship. It was, by the way, a title he came up with, and one that, you can ask her about this later, Ellen put on wine labels. Dan had broad interests, and he published widely, but it all came back to light for a world in darkness, security for an insecure world. Dan believed that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He would want us to have this assurance today. Again, thank you for being here to honor Dan and the light he brought to this world.
Now for Dick Swanson. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Good afternoon. I'm Dick Swanson. I'm a friend of Dan Caldwell's. I've been a friend of his for 55 years. It's hard to get through this, but I'm looking forward to it. It's a great honor to have been asked by his family to celebrate his life through the lens of our long friendship. In the summer of 1970, I was working at a place called Malibu. Not the Malibu down on the beach here, at a remote place on the British Columbia coast called the Malibu Club in Canada, a destination yachting resort built in the 1940s that later became a summer camp for teenagers. Someone came up to me and said, "You need to meet Dan Caldwell. You're both going to be living in Cambridge, Massachusetts." We met briefly at that time, but in the coming academic year, our friendship began to grow. It turned out Dan and Lora had rented an apartment only a block from the Harvard campus, where I was in college, and Dan was starting a graduate program in international relations at nearby Tufts University. I saw a lot of Dan and Lora that year, including memorable trips to Cape Cod, north to New Hampshire for the fall foliage, and lots of discussions around their dinner table. Although I had grown up in Seattle, and Dan was originally from Oklahoma and Southern California, we discovered we had a lot in common. After that year in Massachusetts, Dan and Lora returned to California, where Dan was on active duty as a naval officer, serving as an instructor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. I finished college, moved to England for graduate studies, and then came back to the West Coast for law school at Stanford. Coincidentally, Dan and Lora had returned to Stanford by then for Dan to start his PhD. Living less than a mile apart, the next 3 years provided another opportunity to learn a lot more about Dan. I discovered, like you, Eric, that he was an avid tennis player as well as a patient coach for novices like me. Dan and I shared a love for skiing as well as exploring the Pacific Coast beaches. I also learned from personal experience to be on constant lookout for Dan's practical jokes. I never knew when I'd find my bed short-sheeted, or ice trickling down my back, or sitting down on a whoopee cushion. As some of you probably experienced, Dan upped his game later in life when he discovered the Annoyatron. The Annoyatron was a small electronic gizmo that he could hide under someone's chair or behind a lamp, and it would make random, irritating noises. I also learned that Dan was a damn good listener, and he remembered and he thought about everything he heard. Maybe that's why he was such a great storyteller. He had a prodigious collection of hilarious personal and family stories that he could trot out to fit almost any occasion. When my wife and I moved back to Seattle to start careers and soon a family, Dan and Lora found their way to Pepperdine and their home in Pacific Palisades. Living on opposite ends of the West Coast, We continued our friendship, sharing family vacations in California or in the Pacific Northwest as our children grew up. One of my favorite memories was our visit to the Caldwell family beach cabin in San Clemente in July 1984. Unbeknownst to us, Dan had planned a summer Olympics for our children, who were between 2 and 7 at the time, Beth, Ellen, and John, and Jordan and Annika Swanson, who were here. Dan's backyard Olympic Games went on for days, with opening ceremonies, parades with kids carrying international flags, competition after competition, awarding of medals, and singing of the national anthem. Dan loved kids, and he had a knack for entertaining them. I was delighted to see those qualities revealed again in Dan's later years with his beloved grandchildren, Evie and Emmy. After our children grew and left for college, I was able to get to Southern California from time to time and visit Dan in the Palisades or in San Clemente. I met some of the great people he had talked about. I learned more about the many friendships he enjoyed with neighbors in Pacific Palisades, colleagues at Pepperdine, friends he worked with at Third Point Systems, and so many others. A couple of times I joined the weekly men's Bible study class at Pali Presbyterian. I also attended classes with Dan at Pepperdine and heard him lecture. I was impressed not only with his teaching, but his devotion for his students. Having observed Dan in so many different roles and situations, I must say he had an extraordinary gift of truly connecting with people. Truly connecting with people. I was going through a difficult patch in my own life, as my first marriage was, after more than 30 years, was falling apart. Dan and a close mutual friend named Gord Sloan, who's here, listened patiently, carried my sadness, and provided loving support during this lonely time. About 20 years ago, I found new love and life with my bride Tilda, who's sitting with our sons Peter and Ted over here. We have since lived most of our lives in Des Moines, Iowa, of all places, but changes in my family and in my location didn't change anything about my friendship with Dan. He lovingly embraced my new family, as he continued also to keep close relationships with my older kids. When degenerative disc disease caused my back to start falling apart, twice I needed major surgery in locations distant from home, and at times when Tilda couldn't leave our young children. Without being asked, Dan somehow put aside his own life and came to join me as my companion and my medical advocate. What an example of true and committed friendship, and of the character of Dan Caldwell. One of the great joys in the more recent years of our friendship was a boat trip from Seattle to Alaska in 2019. The two of us took almost a month exploring over 1,000 miles of the beautiful coastline between Seattle and Southeast Alaska in my 31-foot tug. Truly our most memorable adventure together, but also a time for plenty of reflection as we were both around the 70-year milestone in our lives. Dan talked about his family, how much he loved Lora, and appreciated her companionship throughout his entire adult life. How thankful and proud he was of his children, and somewhat amazed at the interesting paths that they took through life. How he hoped that his son-in-law Joey and his grandchildren, who lived in Mexico at the time, would be able to live safe, healthy, and happy lives in this country. We reflected on how thankful we both were to have had loving parents who supported our education, encouraged our activities, and nurtured our faith. We often compared our own faith journeys from Sunday school as children through our teen years with Young Life, studying religion in college, as well as our adult experiences of both deep spiritual inspiration as well as disappointments at times with the institutional church. Nevertheless, we appreciated that each of us had continued to experience and be enriched by God's love and grace throughout our lives. If Dan were here, he would have read the verse, Micah 6:8, that Professor Williams mentioned. Following Dan's cancer diagnosis 4 years ago, we continued our friendship much as before. The following summer, Dan and I went back to Alaska at the invitation of an Alaskan friend. Dan made friends everywhere we went. And one of them invited us to come up and cruise on his boat. The photo on the cover of your program, taken at Kenai Fjords National Park, conveys in Dan's expression just how much he enjoyed that special part of the world. As Dan's cancer progressed, such adventures became impractical, but visits with Dan became even more precious. The last time I saw Dan was in August, when he traveled to Seattle for a weekend with Gord, Sloan, and me. I was beside myself to learn how quickly my dear friend was fading toward the end of last year, and that he would be starting hospice in early January. I desperately wanted to see him one more time and feared that it would not be possible. On the morning of Monday, January 6th, my phone rang, and I heard Dan's voice with that familiar greeting. Dick, this is Dan. Am I calling you at a good time? We had the best conversation ever. Dan's intellect was as sharp as always. We shared memories, and Dan laughed, as always, recalling funny incidents that we'd been involved in. We expressed our love for each other and appreciation for our long friendship. Then I asked Dan pointedly, Dan, is there anything I can do for you? He thought for a moment and said, yes, there is. We've been talking for almost half an hour. I will have to nap now for a couple of hours before I can have another conversation. And I want to call one or two others before the day is over. I don't think I'm going to be able to say goodbye to the members of your family or to most of our friends. Will you please go to them and say goodbye for me and tell them just how much I love them? And now it's my pleasure to call upon Beth, Caldwell, and Emiliano.
to Granddad. He's, I'm sure, so proud of you. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. Thank you for all of the efforts that you've made with PCH being closed and people traveling from all over. We really appreciate you just being here to stand with us and honor our father. It means so much. And a special thank you to Robert Williams, to Bob Escudero, to Lee Katz, everyone here at Pepperdine who really just handled organizing this beautiful service for us. We couldn't have done it, and we just thank you so much for creating this beautiful space for us to honor our father. It feels so unnatural to be here at Pepperdine without my dad. He's brought me and my siblings here for literally our entire lives. I was one when he started teaching here. And we've all worked here or attended school here at some point in our lives. So when we were kids, before all of that, he would bring us up here to go swimming in the pool, and then would take us to get hot dogs at the Mutt Hut down at the Malibu Country Mart. And so at the time, in my little kid brain, I thought that his job was to come up here, go swimming, eat Chips Ahoy because he always had a stash of cookies in his desk drawer, and then pick up mail because in the summer months he would drag us up here to pick up his mail from his mailbox because this was before the internet and email and all of that. But when we talked about these memories more recently, he told me pretty seriously, well, you know, we did that because I had a lot of pressure to work and publish at that time. It was the beginning of his career. And he said, so Mom found a way that we could spend time together as a family. And she brought you up here so that you could swim and we could have dinner together. And then afterwards, she took you guys home and I went back to work. But it really just spoke to the kind of relationship that they had, that my mom would do that and find a way to support his passion. His profession really was a calling for him, but also to create this way that we could still spend such quality time together as a family. And I think really speaks to the true beauty of the relationships that my parents shared for so many years together. One of the themes that's come up in many of the notes that we've received from family and friends in recent weeks is that so many people saw my parents' relationship as one that they modeled their own marriages after, and as a representation really of divine love. They certainly are a model for me, and I'm so grateful that my parents have had the opportunity to spend so much time with me and my husband and our children in the past year and a half since we've been able to come back from Mexico and live with them. I was talking to my mom one day as we were becoming increasingly aware that my dad's time was limited, and I asked her if there was anything she wanted to be sure to tell him while she still could. And she thought about it for a moment and then said very clearly, well, the beauty of our relationship is that we don't have anything that's unsaid. And I told my dad that a couple days later, and he just quietly said, well, that's true. During our last road trip, as my dad was calling it when we were evacuating from the fire, we listened to some of his favorite music, which of course had to include the Beatles. And so when Spotify queued up In My Life, I couldn't help but think about the memories that must have been dancing through his mind. In case you don't remember the words, I'll remind you of some, and I will not be singing them, which is my gift to you for today. But it says, there's places I remember all my life, though some have changed. Some forever, not for better. Some have gone, and some remain. And I just pictured images of his own childhood flashing before his eyes, his parents and his grandparents, his horse, Major, at his home in Oklahoma, where he shared so many good times with Seda and Joe. Memories of moving to California and living next door to his aunt and uncle in San Marino, where he got to see his cousins, Ralph, Pete, Ann, and Susie, every day. His days in the ROTC at Stanford, and then as a naval officer teaching at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he met Ed Lawrence. And Ed, his life wouldn't have been the same without your friendship. I pictured him remembering falling in love with my mom while they were Stanford college kids studying abroad in Austria, and the good times they had with their friends from their Austria group, many of whom became lifelong friends, one of whom is my godfather, Ted, whose love and support meant so much to my dad in his final days. I thought of all his former students who he cared so deeply about, and the friends and colleagues whom he loved. And I'm sure my dad was thinking of those things too. You know, how could you not when you're hearing those lyrics and you're so close to the end? But what stood out the most to him and what he said when we listened to that song was, I love this song because it makes me think of Mom. And then again, he turned to my husband because he wanted to be sure we got this. And he said, Joey, this song always makes me think of Lora. Because in the end, it says, but of all these friends and lovers, there's no one who compares with you. And these memories lose their meaning when I think of love as something new. Though I know I'll never lose affection for the people and things that went before. I know I often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more. And then he asked, please be sure to tell Mom I said that. I just still can't stop thinking that my dad is supposed to be standing here giving this speech because he was always the one to give the speeches at momentous occasions, at all actually of my grandparents' memorial services, at my high school graduation, even at my wedding when the officiant got lost on the way and didn't show up. My dad stepped in to do the service, which he was qualified to do because he had performed the marriage of my BFF from childhood, Erin Hawking, who had asked him to marry her and her husband Josh. And he was so honored to marry them, in particular because of his close friendship with Bill and Karen Hawking, Erin's parents, who really are part of our family. At his retirement ceremony just a few years back, he literally stood right here and gave a speech infinitely more polished and refined than I could ever hope to aspire to today. But one of the things that really stood out to me from the words he shared at his retirement was that a primary reason he was retiring was because he wanted to spend as much time as possible with his grandkids, my kids, Evelyn and Emiliano. He recounted the words of a friend who told him that he had retired because he had a lot of things he needed to teach his grandkids. And my dad really did that. Even before his retirement, he devoted so much time to Evie and Emmy. He cared for them when they were babies, when I would go to work. We traveled to Hawaii and Costa Rica, spent countless hours playing on the beach in San Clemente. He took Evie to practice her monkey bar skills at a park they called Monkey Bar Park, and went to Emiliano's soccer games and soccer practices, and then to their favorite, McDonald's or Carl's Jr. He loved to pick them up from school and take them to get ice cream at McConnell's, and whenever their dessert plate went missing at the dinner table, they knew who was hiding it, just to bring a smile to their little sweet faces. My dad also spearheaded countless flower fights with his grandkids in the backyard by shaking hundreds of flowers off a camellia bush that was in our backyard. It was sort of a California version of a snowball fight. So they would just toss the flowers at one another. And that bush had been in our backyard as long as I can remember, because when I was a kid, he had convinced me, Ellen and John, and all the neighborhood kids, Jeff, Trevor, Aaron, that he was magic and he could turn those flowers into oranges. We also had an orange tree in our backyard. But when I realized that tree, that bush, had burned in the fire, I just broke down. Evie and Emmy, I remember Granddad telling you last month when we realized that he was so sick that he wasn't getting better, that he told you that even when he's gone physically, he's still gonna be with you spiritually and emotionally. And he's watching over you now just like he promised he would be. In the weeks since our dad's death, we've heard from so many friends and family members about random acts of kindness and support that my dad offered them throughout their lives. Things that really appeared effortless and were just part of his caring and empathetic nature. And one time I asked him how did he had maintained such close relationships over so many years with so many people. And he said, well, I think the newspaper clippings help. Because if you didn't know, he read the LA Times and the New York Times cover to cover every day. If he missed 1 or 2 or 10 days because he was traveling, he would come home and stack them up and read them all. And he would think of people he knew and loved, and he would cut out articles that reminded him of people's interests, and he would mail them out with short notes. And many of you I know have received many of those over the years. But on top of the newspaper articles, his kindness goes far beyond that. You know, we've heard so many stories about him reaching out to people in their time of need, when they've lost loved ones, and him keeping in touch for years to honor the memory of a loved one who has passed. And he had just quite a selfless quality about him. He told me about a conversation that he had with his oncologist, Dr. Sai, where he told him he was worried about getting too many blood transfusions because he didn't want to use up blood that other people needed. And his doctor told him, he started laughing and said, well, I've never had a patient express that much concern for other people. My sister Ellen really follows in my dad's footsteps in this regard, and he was so proud of her, not only her professional accomplishments as a professor and a writer, but of her kindness toward friends and family. Like our dad, she writes sweet letters, sends thoughtful gifts, and cultivates friendships in a way that very few people in this world really do. And she carries his love and his light forward, and I'm sure most of you who are here today have experienced that piece of my dad's spirit in her. Anyone who knows my dad also knows how much he loved his parents. He told us that he believed that when those we deeply love die, they don't really leave us. We actually become closer to them because in some way that we can't really understand, some part of them remains inside of us and makes us better and more complete somehow. My brother John and my dad talked a lot about my dad's feelings about dying, and we're able to connect on this deep level in his final years. And my dad was able to share with him that he really felt peace with his death. And as John pointed out to me, our dad was able to be a part of several really important life-changing events for our family in recent years, and we're so grateful that we had that time with him. He was able to see John find his life partner and marry Nadja, and got to know Nadja's beautiful daughter, Gira. He loved talking to them about Russian history, politics, and culture. And he got to see John with his own family, who he loves and cares for deeply, just as our dad loved and cared for us. He got to see my husband, Joel, return to the U.S. from Mexico after so many years of being kept out, and developed a deep personal relationship with him. And although Joel and my dad's life experiences are very different, Joel and my dad really share a common core of kindness, of strength, and of loyalty. And my dad grew to consider Joel a second son, and it means so much to me that we got to return to live with my parents and spend so much time together before we lost my dad. He got to see Ellen create a beautiful home in Sierra Madre where he loved to go and help her garden. And when she first moved in, he was so excited, he even planned a housewarming party for his friends at her house. This past year, she published an amazing book, which he was so proud to see. And he got to see his grandkids' joy at attending the same school I had attended when I was a kid, tracing the footsteps of our old walks to school and reliving the joy of raising his own children by helping me to raise mine. In his final days, he got the most heavenly expression on his face, and he told me, Evie reminds me so much of you when you were young. And I could just see the joy he experienced at seeing glimpses of my younger self in my beautiful daughter, whom he loved so dearly. Father Greg Boyle, a Jesuit priest who my family got to know many years ago through work I did with his nonprofit, he teaches that God's role is not to prevent harm or tragedy from occurring in the world. But what God does is he walks with us through hard times. He carries us through, lifts us up, fills us with light, energy, and love so that we can keep moving forward, find joy and laughter even in the midst of tremendous sadness. And so as we walk through this time of grief and miss my dad and the light that he brought into all of our lives, and as we struggle to piece together our lives in the face of such tremendous losses, which all happen at once, I do take solace in God's words, which Joel reminded me of the other day. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The end of my dad's life will not surprise you because he walked through his final days with the same kind of grace and dignity and quiet yet forceful internal strength that he walked his whole life. He was in a great deal of pain, but he went to great efforts to conceal that from all of us. We could only catch it in fleeting expressions on his face. He wanted things to feel as normal as usual for all of us, especially for my kids. So he would get out of bed in the morning to say goodbye when they went to school, and would save up his energy so he could come downstairs and have dinner around the kitchen table, so that he could have a few more moments with our family and squeeze out a few more precious memories together. On the day before the fire, we prayed at the dinner table, as usual, and my son, Emiliano, prayed that God would make Granddad's journey to heaven safe and comfortable. It was a windy night, so we joked that maybe the wind would carry him and make the journey easier, and Emiliano prayed that Granddad would feel joy at being reunited with his parents and grandparents and all the other friends and family members he had loved in his life. And I'm sure that is the case. When I was a young girl, my dad would put me on a child seat on the back of his bike and would ride with me down to Mescal Canyon to the beach. And in a speech he gave at my wedding, he recounted me screaming out, "Daddy, we're going as fast as the wind." And although this might seem strange, given the destruction that the wind stirred up in the recent fires, I think of my dad when I feel the wind touching my face, when I'm on a boat riding through the ocean with wind in my hair, when I'm standing quietly feeling the warmth of the sun and a breeze suddenly touches me. I hope for all of us that we'll find ways to keep the lessons we've learned from my dad, from in and out of the classroom, lessons he taught, but also those modeled by a life well lived. That we'll find ways to keep those memories and lessons alive inside of us. That we'll think of him when the breeze touches us, or at other times that make more sense for each of you. And in this way that he'll become a part of us, so we don't lose him, but we become closer to him. And Dad, we wish for you smooth sailing always.
First, I just want to reiterate all the thanks for everyone who's here. You all held a tremendous place in my dad's heart and life, and even if you are our friends who never got to meet him, I know that you know his spirit through us. So I'm going to share two of my dad's guiding imperatives: be prepared and show up. And although I have a lifetime of memories to draw from for both of these categories, many of the stories I'll tell today relate to recent events because of the extraordinary times we've been living through in this short year. My dad was an Eagle Scout at age 14. This is something so important to him that he reminded me of it when we were talking about his obituary. In fact, it will not surprise many of you that he had prepared 98% of his own obituary. First working on it closer to his diagnosis in 2021, and then editing it sporadically thereafter. The Eagle Scout part was in his early drafts, but the age he became one was not. And this is something I took as being exceptional. And it also meant that he was always prepared, and more so. And in being so prepared, he prepared our family for life's uncertainties too. Our dad had always told us that during a fire, it's time to worry if we can see flames from our house. So on January 7th, we all knew immediately that this was no ordinary day. We also knew that we had literally just said our goodbyes to him, and that the end was very near. So we were not sure exactly when and if we could evacuate. But our dad, in his infinite wisdom and preparedness, recognized the imminent danger in knowing the flames' proximity and in watching the spectacular air show as the water planes flew overhead. That he eventually got up on his own, got dressed, packed his wallet and an expensive chemo medicine that he hoped to donate, and appeared downstairs, prompting all of us to evacuate safely and in time. He was prepared, and he saved us all. As my mom and I were evacuating, I panicked momentarily, remembering that my gas had been on low the last time I had driven. But I laughed as soon as I saw my gauge, remembering that when we had gone to my dad's last doctor's appointment, that he had encouraged me to fill up my car at our favorite cheap gas station on Lincoln. And he had in fact paid for the tank of gas that took my mom, our dogs, and me out of the Palisades into safety. Later in January, I was still evacuated from my house because of the Eaton fire, and I was staying at a hotel one night. I had thought I had brought my toiletry kit with me, but I hadn't, and so I was rummaging through my car looking for it, and I found a brand new toiletry kit from the UCLA hospital. This is something my dad had encouraged me to take from his hospital room at his last day to keep in my car in case of emergency. Again, he was more prepared than I was, and again, he was still taking care of us. When I spoke to Schaefer about my dad's passing, he said that my dad had once told him that the last thing a parent does is to teach their own children about death. This resonated with me immediately because one of the last things my dad had told me before he went unconscious was that we might hear a death rattle when his breathing was slowing, and that it might sound painful, but that it wouldn't be, and we shouldn't worry about it. Even in his last moments, he was always prepared for seeing an issue and then being sure to prepare us for it too. They say that when an elder dies, a library burns. I have always understood this as a powerful metaphor, but in so many ways that became literal on January 8th. My dad's wealth of knowledge, of course, went with him physically, but we also lost his study full of research notes, books, and writing. Because of my dad's foresight, though, he had also already distributed many of his books, files, and famous news clippings to his friends and colleagues after his retirement and in the years that followed. Many of you here are the cherished recipients. And he had already sent his Cold War and Stanford ROTC papers to both the Harvard Project on Cold War Studies and the Hoover Institution, bolstering their archives, saving his important collections from the fire's destruction, and sharing it with future generations of scholars. He was prepared. Besides being prepared, my dad also always emphasized the importance of showing up. There was one story he often told to illustrate this. After my mom's father had died, one of our friends, Mary Edie, surprised us by driving up to Santa Barbara from Malibu for his memorial. She didn't ask us or tell us she was coming, like so many of you here today. She just showed up, and my dad often talked about how meaningful that was to him and to my mom. He lived by this too. When I played soccer in high school, we often had to leave school early to get across LA and kind of beat traffic to get to different campuses. On one such day, we arrived in Pasadena for an evening soccer game at LaSalle, and I remember the traffic just being horrendous that day and arriving at the field feeling really tired and worn down. We got off the bus and started running warm-up drills on the field, and I heard someone cheer for me and Katie from the sidelines. To my surprise, my dad had come to that game without telling me, leaving work earlier than usual to beat traffic and to arrive at the field before we did. He always showed up, and my siblings and I have hundreds of these stories. Through his actions, he also taught us about the importance of showing up too. The day after the Palisades fire, John crossed police lines to go see our house and to get the confirmation that we dreaded. He took photos and videos of our house and street, and also individually reached out to all of our neighbors he could track down to share the news with them, just as our dad would have done. He showed up. Earlier last year, my friend's mother had passed away, and I attended her memorial. My friend spoke at the service, and I was just blown away at her ability to think and speak so eloquently, passionately, and clearly, especially amidst overwhelming grief. And this is something I'm even more in awe of today. It was such a strong testament to both my friend and to her mother. I had the chance to tell my dad about the memorial, and our conversation held more weight because we knew that this time was coming for him sooner rather than later. I was telling him about Jessica and what an amazing job she had done and how much I admired her strength. She had started by saying, "This is the challenge of my life." And when I told my dad this, he teared up and he said, "That is exactly what I said when speaking at my own father's memorial." And so I'm here with you now, the challenge of my life, during what I hope is the most challenging time of my family's life. And I'm so encouraged by all of you here. You are my dad's family, friends, colleagues, students, and community. And through his life of service, leadership, devotion, teaching, outreach, and friendships, he has prepared me and my family to get through the hardest of times right now. And each of you have shown up for us. You are here helping to carry us now, exactly as he's doing from heaven. And we thank you.
turn your programs around and join me in singing